Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So again, Denny and I have not been meeting up lately, just due to the pandemic going on. So we haven't filmed normal episodes. So I apologize for that. Hoping to bring some interesting Inbetweenisodes. This is an idea that I sort of had on the back burner for a little while. And, you know, one way to approach tea and to approach just trying to learn more about tea is to just take sort of the different categories of tea. So you have like raw pu'erh, ripe pu'erh, oolongs, green tea, etc. And then you can sort of further subcategorize those, get more repetitions with different sorts of those categories. So it's like, oh, I want to try a bunch of like 10 to 15-year-old raw pu'erh. Great. I want to try some young raw pu'erh. I want to try some 20-year-old raw pu'erh. So there's different ways you can sort of subcategorize tea just to learn more. So one way to, one subcategory, I should say, of ripe tea that I think is important to kind of like note there's sort of differences in a category of tea, ripe, that really can muddle together quite a bit, is the fermentation level. So ripe pu'erh undergoes, typically at least, a 45-day process where they are essentially doing a process very similar to composting, introducing the tea to really humid conditions over the course of 45 days, heated as well, I believe, and sometimes you'll hear this process called wet piling. There's a bunch of different names for it. So the point is that you can have there are varying degrees. You can sort of crank your humidifiers all the way to 95, or you could try to have the humidity at 85. So there are different sort of gradations on how heavy you can do that. I don't know enough to know sort of what the standard is and what constitutes in terms of specific like ripening parameters, light, medium, or heavy, but as someone that approaches it as more of a consumer of it, I do think it's worth drawing that sort of difference and sort of subcategorizing ripe into sort of light fermentation, middle fermentation, and heavy fermentation. And I think it's also an important descriptor that you'll see, and I find it to be actually quite helpful when reading someone like Yunnan Sourcing or White to Tea's description, if they describe the fermentation as lighter, more medium, or more heavy. So I think that's just sort of conceptually something to look at and a way to say, okay, this is lighter fermentation. What does this taste like? This other tea is lighter fermentation. What does this taste like? Try to see some similarities and commonalities just to learn a little bit more about it. I think when ripe in particular, and I talked about this a little earlier, categories really do tend to muddle together. Raw, I think, does have quite a bit more range. Aging generally does more to change and transform raw pu'erh than it does ripe pu'erh. But this is one of the categories that I do personally look at when it comes to here. A couple things. Lighter fermentation is supposedly a little bit closer to the original process that really isn't that old, developed in the mid-1970s by a couple of the tea factories back then. But pu'erh people tend to be very nostalgic people and tend to like stuff more how it used to be. And I think a lot of that is for a good reason, actually, not to just make fun of them. So a lot of people like this stuff. Back then, in the wild old days, 70s, 80s, 90s, when people were trying to just, people were figuring stuff out more, is just a different scene in general. There's a couple of ways they did it. They would do this sort of lighter fermentation method. You would see more methods of mixing raw and ripe. And the point is to just sort of give it a little more dynamicism, create more of a layered, textured taste. Lighter fermentation has a reputation for being more interesting to age. It might transform a little bit more than like a heavily fermented ripe pu'erh, something like a Chateau that would definitely classify as like a more heavy fermentation experience. So that's just a little background about this. Don't necessarily need to know it, but I do find it to be somewhat interesting. So the tea I'm going to be bringing on today is the 2018 V93 Tuo. I'm just about finished with this tea, drinking this tea. I think I have like maybe half a session left. Been drinking it in sort of just the very normal patterns that I have it with my wife in the morning, and then I'll have maybe a cup or two later on in the day. And so this comes in tool form. It's not a cake, but it is, I believe, considered to be one of sort of your standard Dayi recipes that they make. I don't know if it's every year, but they do make it quite often. Sometimes it's 250 grams, sometimes it's 100 grams. It might vary. And it's known to be sort of their one of their classic lighter fermentation products. Dayi is more or less sort of the real standard for sort of mass-produced ripe pu'erh. I drink their tea regularly. I like their tea. But this is actually, interestingly, one I've gone through a couple tools, and the previous tool I went through, not this one, but the previous one, I didn't necessarily have my favorite ripe experiences with it. So I was sort of curious to revisit this, and that must have been 4 or 5 years ago. No, probably even more at this point. So I wanted to try this. I wanted to also try one that wasn't the same year of. So this has, just 2 years of age since pressing, but it's could be quite a different experience than having just the 2020 V93. Not doing the side by side, so I can't say for sure, but I wanted to make sure that I had a little bit more age under it. So that's why I bought something that was a couple of years ago. Just got this from Yunnan Sourcing, so let's get into the tea. Okay, so here we go. I am doing steep number 5, and I will make steep number 6 here. So here is my proof of purchase, the little ticket that you get with different cakes and tools. This is the only thing I keep of cakes. I dump the wrappers. There's just going to be too many wrappers over the course of my lifetime, unless I die in the next couple of years. So here is steep number 5. So again, my initial experience, or my previous experience with this tea, was that it was actually one of my least favorite Dayi recipes at the time. So I've been actually kind of pleasantly, spoilers, I've been pleasantly happy with this tea, and I like it a lot more than I expected to. This is by no means an expensive tea to get. You can definitely get it for under 10 cents a gram. I'm using 8.5 to 9 grams here. We'll see if that brews out a little bit light here. Maybe should have brewed it for just maybe in like another 20 seconds or something. Not sure, but we will see. All right, so let's take a smell. Nice aromatic, pretty standard ripe smells coming off of it. Just sort of your standard sweet wet wood. Cheers. Creamy, woody. I wouldn't say it's fully sort of at that sort of silky, very smooth, silky texture, but it does move a little bit more into that vein. Nice sweetness to it all. Yeah, it's just a really nice, well-balanced tea. I quite enjoy this, and I enjoy it quite a bit more than I did the previous time. And when you and I think that's a good reminder and a humbling experience that tastes do change, and sometimes you're just going to run into a tool that, for whatever reason, maybe it was stored too dry, maybe something happened to it. There are all kinds of possibilities of why you might get a tool or something like that, or a cake, and it doesn't necessarily line up. So I think it's important to be humble and to come back to it and not necessarily overly judge things. So I'm actually very glad I came back to this tea. I think it's definitely something I could drink, every now and then. I think it's a very, very solid ripe, and I definitely don't think it's the worst Dayi tea. Not that Dayi really makes terrible ripe or anything like that. And I think it's well worth checking out. So here's steep number 6. Let's see if I underbrewed it. Yeah, maybe a touch underbrewed, but overall, I think it's fine. Just sort of bringing that standard woody texture, woody taste to it. And I mean, this is nothing that's not going to really like knock your socks off as far as ripe tea, but I do think it's a good reference to get. I mean, like if I were recommending someone to get like 5 reference points on starting ripe Pu'erh, this very well might be sort of on that list. And the fact that you can buy a tool, which you can get a bunch of reps, but you don't necessarily need to get 100 reps on, 50 reps on like you would a whole cake, I think is a plus as well. So I think it's definitely well worth checking out if you haven't, if you're curious to sort of explore and try different lighter fermented ripes. I think this is a good reference tea as well to try it. And the nice thing with the Dayi teas is they're widely available. This is not expensive at all. You can spend under $10 and get a whole range of a whole bunch of sessions out of this. Even using like the 8.5, 9 grams I'm probably getting 12 sessions out of this. So not bad at all, considering that I'm using a fair amount of leaf, brewing for a couple people as well. Cheers. Yeah, and interesting comparison versus like a Cha To or something. This is not maybe as rounded. I'd say it's still pretty smooth, but maybe not quite as like big and smooth as those teas are. Probably offers a little bit more in terms of like texture and dynamicism. I like both of those things. Sometimes I can also go for the more heavy fermentation. Also an interesting one to just sort of set aside, see if it changes, take some notes, compare it versus the buy the 2018 one, compare it versus the 2021. You can do a bunch of different stuff with this tea. Okay, so I think that just about wraps up this Inbetweenisode. Going to give this tea a solid 6.0 rating. Let me know if you have tried lighter fermented ripe and what your reference point is. I'm happy to see places like Yunnan Sourcing and White Tea sort of listing how they feel about the ripe process, and I know both of them, having ripes under their own label, have probably taken more of an interest in the actual processing part of it. So if you're curious about that, I'm sure you could ask them questions about that and how some of their tea differs from that. So the next ripe episode will be quite a different one. I will be bringing on one of the highest end ripes that I have tried pretty much ever, a white tea one. So I'm excited to bring that on and talk a little bit about that one. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all next time.